Told Rick that when I was preparing this week for today's lessons, I kind of wrote what I did this morning earlier in the week, and then I was thinking about tonight and was looking at these things, and I wanted to teach this lesson out of the narrative. That Proverb 9 was our announcement reading this morning, and then we come back to it. I don't know, for some reason this felt like a Sunday night sermon, and this morning's felt like a Sunday morning sermon, so I didn't do this morning. Never mind. Anyway, you get it, right? And we didn't do exactly maybe in the order that we should have in some senses. So I just asked Rick to come back to this narrative and read it again so that we can kind of come back and look at it. It's kind of an interesting text, actually. If you watch, it almost in some ways reads like poetry. Because if you notice, there's like a transferring thought every 3 verses. So he gives there's three verses that kind of have a concept, and then the next 3 verses have a concept, and the next 3 verses have a concept, and you work through the narrative in that fashion. So this evening, if you would, let's just spend some time right here in this. And I actually want to do 2 things. I want to look at the proverb itself, and then I want to also compare it to some things that Jesus actually taught and said about this same topic. And so let's this evening talk about wisdom. And which one would we choose? And how do we know the difference between the two? And which side of this equation do we find ourselves on? And which one is more compelling to me as I strive to honor God? So let's look at the first 3 verses of Proverb 9. And let's notice that he talked about some things that wisdom has. And he said that wisdom, number one, has a constructed, solid foundation, or he uses the term house. For wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out 7 pillars. It's interesting when you think about that number 7 being that symbolic number of completeness. And so when he speaks about this house, he talks about it being complete. He talks about this house being finished in such a way that it can serve the purpose that it needs to serve. Wisdom constructs a solid house. Wisdom allows for me to have some personal accountability to my conduct. Wisdom allows for me to construct my personal behaviors in the manner in which God would find appropriate and that which God would appreciate and honor in me. It allows for us to make preparation to share then what we've gained. Notice, she has slaughtered her meat. She has mixed her wine. She has also furnished her table. Now, by the way, that mixed or mingled her wine, that can be troublesome in some ways because the Proverbs also talk about mingled or mixed wines in a negative sense. This seems to be talking about, at least in the analogy, this in a positive sense. I kind of lend with most scholars that I could read from that what you're talking about here is a wine that is mixed with spices, that it's prepared for the purpose of a feast. Not prepared for the redness of the eyes and all the challenging things that other proverbs speak of. But this idea here is that she has prepared a meal that is ready for partaking of. She spent extra time making sure that it's exactly what will be beneficial and helpful to all those who gather together. Wisdom prepares. Wisdom doesn't take anything to chance. Wisdom doesn't just hope that things will work out okay. Wisdom recognizes that if I want an ordered life, if I want a house that is constructed in the right ways, then I'm going to have to make the proper preparation in order for that to happen. I think too many times in our lives we take for granted whether or not I'll grow spiritually. We take for granted whether or not I will accomplish the spiritual things that God desires from me. And we do that on the basis of our lack of preparation for it. If I want a solid spiritual house in which to honor the Lord with, my personal life, to honor Jehovah with, then I need to be making preparation for that. She's prepared her dinner, and she spent the time to slaughter the meat and mix the wines, make it special. She's furnished her table. I have to admit that I'm guilty sometimes. Deborah loves to do that. Deborah loves to furnish a table. I'm content with paper plate, plastic, right, and a styrofoam cup. I'm more interested in the food and what's going to be in it. But she likes to furnish a table. She likes to make it look good, prepare it, make it comfortable for those who will be sitting at it, and that's not a bad thing. The idea here is that wisdom wants to do all things necessary to make this as good as possible. It's preparation in order for when this feast occurs, and that's the analogy that's being drawn. When this feast occurs, everything is prepared, everything is set in order. It will be perfectly suited for all those who come to her home to take advantage of this celebration, if you will, that she's preparing. And in fact, notice the next thought. She invites others to come and take benefit from this. She has sent out her maidens. She cries out from the highest places of the city. Wisdom wants us not just to be personally focused upon Jehovah. Wisdom doesn't want us just to make sure that our personal lives and personal accountability to God is in order, but it wants us to prepare things in such a way that we're ready to invite others to come and partake as well. I want my life to be filled with opportunity to share and to reach out and to let others know about salvation in Jesus, to let others know the great benefit of a relationship with the Creator. We want a house. Wisdom leads me to this. To where I want others to come and experience that same thing. Now, mark your Bibles if you want there in Proverb 9. We'll be back there in just a moment. But I want you to go look. It's some highly similar language that's used by Jesus as it relates to the idea of wisdom. In Matthew chapter 22, notice with me in verse 1. Matthew chapter 22, when He decides to impart wisdom, and by the way, in many occasions when Jesus does this, He does this through parable form. When Jesus wants to impart wisdom to the hearers, and He's really in some ways not so sure whether they're ready to grasp the fullness of the concepts, what Jesus does is He uses parables. Stories, if you will, that they're able to relate to that might help them understand some spiritual application. So He begins to respond to this scene He's in here at this parable of the wedding feast. And He answered and spoke to them again by parables and said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son. And he sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, and they were not willing to come." Now, we'll talk more about that before we're done, but I want you to just notice the similarities. Wisdom is spoken in the feminine over there in Proverb chapter 9, and so he talks about her and she and what wisdom she is doing, and he says she's prepared her house, it's well constructed, she's now assembled the table, the food is prepared, the wine is prepared, the table has been furnished, everything is ready, and then her maidens go out and tell others that come and receive the benefits. It's interesting to me that when Jesus speaks in parable form here, He uses really the same proverb. Maybe not in identical form, but it's the same concept. A celebration has been prepared, a marriage feast has been prepared, and they call to all those who might come and be partakers of that. Wisdom constructs, wisdom prepares, wisdom puts everything in order, and then wants others to come and gain benefit from that. When we learn something beneficial spiritually, we would want to share that, I would hope. Jesus had a tremendous invitation to offer unto others. Jesus had a spiritual feast that He came to prepare to all those who would come and receive it. And so His declaration is, come and receive the benefits. That's what wisdom does. Wisdom wants to impart and share that knowledge and whatever benefit others, or whatever benefit I have gained personally, that others might benefit in the same fashion. Wisdom has constructed a solid house through preparation, ready to offer anything that it can to encourage others to appreciate who God is and what God has in store. And then go back and notice Proverb 9 again. So wisdom's done all these things to make ready and to offer the opportunities for others to appreciate the wisdom of God. But notice then he turns this a little bit in verse 4 and begins, and I'm not sure why that says verse 7. I apologize for that. But he says, "Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. As for him who lacks understanding, she says to him, Come eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Forsake foolishness and live. Notice then, let me keep reading with you because I think I flipped my charts. But he says, He who corrects a scoffer gets shame for himself. He who rebukes a wicked man only harms himself. Do not correct a scoffer lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man and he will be still wiser. Teach a just man and he will increase in learning. So let me share with you here what he's talking about. In verses 7 through 9, and again the warning, and I'll come back hopefully if my charts are right. If not, I'll do it by memory. But when we look at these warnings in verses 7 through 9, notice that he says, Not everyone who needs wisdom will want wisdom. Not everybody who needs to understand something from God's will, not everyone who needs to benefit from the wisdom of God is going to want and desire to have it. That's hard to take sometimes, by the way. Have you ever had some piece of information that you found was valuable and important and you thought that it needed to be shared with others and all they heard was blah, 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 blah? You thought you had the greatest piece of wisdom to ever offer mankind and they were as disinterested could be. And the same thing happens sometimes when the wisdom of God is being imparted. For some reason, men have chosen and have decided they're not interested in what God has to share. And may I suggest to you that you and I are not forced to pound wisdom into them, even though that's what we might like to do. This is an interesting proverb to me. I'm going to compare it to something Jesus said here in just a moment as well. But we're not required to force wisdom upon the scornful. Do not correct, notice verse 8 again. Do not correct a scoffer lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man, he'll love you. A man desiring of wisdom, a man who wants a better understanding of God's will and purposes, he will appreciate the fact that you're willing to share and to discuss and to impart wisdom. But he says the scoffer, he said he's just going to hate you, and you don't owe him to force wisdom upon him. I think that's a lesson all of us maybe need to appreciate. Because I think sometimes we believe we have failed others when they've refused wisdom. Friends, you have not failed anybody simply because they chose to ignore the wisdom of God. You haven't failed them. And you are not required, according to the proverb, according to something we'll look at here in just a moment, we are not required to force them to embrace the wisdom of God. In fact, he says all you get done when you force the scornful to try to listen to the wisdom of God is they hate you and they still don't have the wisdom. We're not required to do that. Wisdom will seek wisdom. That's what he said the wise man does. He'll love the instruction. Give instruction to a wise man and he will still be wiser. Teach a just man and he will increase in learning. You want to know what the greatest evidence is of whether or not you're a wise person, whether you're part of this wisdom description here? You want to know one of the greatest evidences of that fact? It's whether you and I are willing to listen when others are sharing wisdom. Evidence will be whether or not you and I are willing to hear and pay attention to the instructions and guidance and help that is coming from others. A great sign of wisdom is the willingness to listen to the wise. And yet so often people turn deaf ears and push aside any kind of knowledge and benefit that might be extended unto others. Wisdom seeks wisdom. And will I strive to gain the benefits from it? It's my obligation. But on the other side of that, don't ever feel like I have to force others to honor the wisdom of God. Now, unless you think that that's not carried out in other contexts, let's jump to some things that are taught in the New Testament. Jump to Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Words of Jesus. Do not give what is holy to the dogs. Cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces. I recognize that sometimes we need to appreciate the idea that we have to reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and all doctrine. I understand that there are moments where we have to present what the truth of God's will is, irregardless of whether somebody is receptive or unreceptive to it. But we don't have to continue to feed it. If it's been trampled underfoot, then my obligation is not to bring the trough back in a feed kind of description here. My obligation is not just to continue to force it. That Jesus said, don't continue to give the dogs what is holy. Don't throw the pearls before the swine. Some of the greatest pieces of wisdom maybe that is being offered unto us as it relates to this subject is to not feel compelled to keep taking the abuse and difficulties and hardships upon ourselves when others reject the testimony of God's wisdom. Verse 14 of Matthew chapter 10, when He speaks to His disciples and they are about to go out and begin to preach and teach the gospel, He says, and whoever will not receive you nor hear your words, when you depart from that house or city, shake off the dust from your feet. And friends, let me suggest to you, that is not a disposition or attitude of, well, good riddance. That's not what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is trying to compel His disciples to appreciate, that if there are those who reject the wisdom of God, it's not their fault. So when you leave that town or that city and you feel like an absolute failure because they didn't want to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, you need to shake that dust from your feet and move on to the next location, because you can't control how everybody will or will not respond to the message of God. You won't be able to control every factor. You can't decide on behalf of others whether they will do what God desires from them. So wisdom warns me, not everyone will heed wisdom even though they may need it. Wisdom also reminds me that I'm not required to force feed and throw pearls before the swine and just continue to let people trample the message of God under their feet. I'm not accountable and responsible when those who should be embracing the wisdom of God refuse to do so. And then look with me at verses 10 through 12. He says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. For by me your days will be multiplied, and years of life will be added to you. If you are wise for yourself. And if you scoff, you will bear it alone. We need to appreciate that wisdom is from God, not from us. Our first and foremost obligation is to fear the Lord first. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom can't ever be gained if there is not a healthy fear and respect for who God is first. We will never appreciate and understand what God's purposes for me are and what God desires from me if I first don't have a fear and respect for Him. Wisdom starts and finishes with God. And if it's wise, it came from Him. And if it brings benefit, it came from Him. And if it's that which should govern our lives, it came from Him. When we share it and we spread that table and furnish that table and prepare that feast and invite others to come, then we need to be very careful and cautious that they understand that what's being offered in terms of the wisdom is not from us as the source, but it's coming from God Himself. because it's based in His testimony. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And it has eternal benefit or consequence. For by me your days will be multiplied and years of life will be added to you. Whether or not we embrace the wisdom of God will have a tremendous effect on whether or not we find ourselves eternally rewarded or consequentially. How I embrace what God shares with me will have an obvious effect upon my eternal state and condition. I think about the teachings of Jesus over in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 15. Matthew chapter 11 and in verse 15. Where Jesus makes this very simple statement when He says, "He that hath ears to hear, let him hear." If you want wisdom and you want guidance and you want help and you want assistance, then you've got to have open ears. We've got to have open ears and an open mind and an open heart to be receptive to that which God is sharing with us. Wisdom's coming from God. He's a legitimate source. He's someone that we ought to be honoring and listening to. His instructions are valuable to us. And so because I fear Him first, I'm ready and willing to embrace all the wisdom that He extends. Jesus tells us, listen. A wise person will listen to what God has to share with us. A wise person won't be scornful or mock towards the things that God shares. We will understand the importance of it and adhere to those things. But friends, folly appeals to the simple-minded, He said. Go back to Proverb 9 and let's read that last section. We didn't read it in our hearing tonight, but let me go back and let's look at these last 6 verses, because there's wisdom that God's imparting that He wants us to embrace, but there's also a folly side to this that we need to be careful about as well. Verse 13, a foolish woman is clamorous. She is simple and knows nothing. For she sits at the door of her house on a seat by the highest places of the city to call to those who pass by, who go straight on their way. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. And as for him who lacks understanding, she says to him, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of hell. Tremendous contrast between wisdom and folly. A tremendous benefit to us when wisdom is applied. But the counter to that is the folly that comes. And just like wisdom desires for others to come and gain benefit from it, just like it's prepared a table before others and invites others to come and to experience its benefits, folly does the same. Folly is described here as this clamorous woman who's standing here, maybe at the door of her house, or maybe at a high place in the city where people can see her as they pass by, and she's imploring folks to come. But folly doesn't have the same benefits to offer as wisdom did. Folly has, in fact, tremendous difficulty and hardship awaiting those who respond and hear. You see, because folly has no conscience. Did you notice that description that folly has? It says folly will offer. Remember wisdom? Wisdom builds a strong house, prepares the meat, prepares the feast, furnishes the table, invites folks to come and to experience that. What's folly do? Folly says, I've stolen some stuff. I've stolen some water. It's really good. Come and share. Come and experience the bread. Yeah, I didn't spend a whole lot of preparing. But eating bread in secret and hiding because of the manner in which we obtained it is appealing to the foolish. See, wisdom has a conscience about it. Wisdom desires to do things in the right ways and do them in the manner which God has prescribed. Foolishness says it doesn't matter how you get it. Foolishness sears the conscience at every turn. Foolishness has no concern as to whether or not the means by which to obtain what we're using was by honest means or not, because it has no conscience. And then it implores anybody else who wants to act and function in such a way to join in. Wisdom is far superior, but folly has its appeal. There's a pretty bold declaration, though, at the end of that narrative when he says, but he does not know, the simple who's being allured by all this, the simple who walks by her house and she's standing there at the door, and no, not a great feast prepared, but she says, I've got some stolen stuff that I got. If you want to come and join in, we can go over here and hide and partake in all these things that we really don't deserve. And here he goes. It's highly similar, by the way, in the description of temptation in Proverbs 7. If you go back and look at it sometimes, you'll see a comparative kind of thinking. The young man there gets lured in by a not-so-virtuous woman. And the text says, like an arrow through his heart, she destroys him because he was simple. Friends, you might say, well, what's the harm in not gaining the wisdom that God has to offer? What's the harm in not fearing God and letting that be the beginning of wisdom? What's the harm in trampling underfoot the message that God provides? Who am I hurting if I don't pay attention to the instructions of God? And you're hurting yourself and casting your lot with the dead and thrusting your life into the depths of hell, he says, when we reject the message that God has prepared for us. There's stark contrast between wisdom and folly. There's a stark contrast between that which is wise and prudent and beneficial and that which leads to destruction. And now the choice is mine to make. Jesus speaks similarly over in John chapter 5. In John chapter 5 and verse 24. John chapter 5 verse 24. Jesus says, most assuredly, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from death into life. Most assuredly, there's that phrase a couple of times, most assuredly I say to you, the hour is coming and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. Those who listened and heard the wisdom of God to the resurrection of life, those who foolishly ignored the wisdom of God, followed in with the simple ones, have led themselves down a path of destruction. You and I have to choose. The Proverbs were pretty clear. The benefit of wisdom far outweighs the destruction of folly. But at the end of the day, I still have to make a choice. What will I do with the instructions of God? Have I been one of those who have been just trampling it underfoot, ignoring it at every turn? And there may have been some people in my life who've worked awful hard to try to share that message with me, to encourage me. But I found no pleasure in those testimonies. Folly and foolishness appeals to the simple. But the question for me is, which of these will I respond to? Which of them will I trust and put my faith and confidences in? Which of these will I find benefit in? Wisdom leads to salvation and hope. Wisdom leads to the encouragement and strength that God provides. Foolishness leads to destruction and eternal consequence. The wisdom of God is far superior to anything man would ever say or think. The question still remains, what will I do? With my opportunity to embrace God's wisdom, what will I do? With the temptation to listen to the simple ones, what will I do with the wisdom of God and the salvation message that's found within it? And the truth is, many an intelligent person from human standards, many an intelligent person from human standards has rejected the wisdom of God. There are a lot of there are a lot of academics out there that are really smart when it comes to academics. There are a lot of folks out there who are highly intelligent as far as intelligence of men is concerned, but they have rejected the greatest piece of wisdom that has ever been known to man, and that is the wisdom that comes from God. The distinction between the wise and the foolish is not academics. The distinction between the wise and the foolish is not credentials and accolades. The difference between the wise and the foolish is who fears God and who doesn't. Who has recognized that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom and who's rejected that notion? Who fears God enough to want to hear and listen to what He actually has to say, and those who have trampled on. That's really the distinction between the two. And so I ask you tonight, what will you trust and obey in your life? What will you rely upon for your life and your guidance and your instruction and your purpose? Will you let the wisdom of God be the director of your paths? Will you let the wisdom of God shine forth, giving me the guidance to make preparation and do the right things that guide me to be ready for eternity? Will I obey His will, or will I scornfully mock at it? Will I trample it underfoot and just follow in line with so many others who followed the folly path that has led to eternal consequence? Will you consider your life and your relationship with God even this hour? Could we help you tonight to choose wisely, to follow in the paths of God? Will you adhere to the wisdom that God has to offer and bring eternal benefit? And if we could help you do that, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?